All right, for this video, I wanted to cover what exactly is a qualifying child for the child tax credit. So I think there's a lot of confusion in this space because there are some subtle distinctions or differences between what is a qualifying child just to be able to claim somebody as a dependent on your tax return versus what is a qualifying child in order to get the child tax credit, right? Because it's possible to have someone that's a qualifying child and claim them as a dependent on your return, but they're not a qualifying child in order to get the child tax credit. Okay, so what are the tests? And then I'll talk a bit about how there's some differences or what the notable differences are between qualifying children for purposes of the CTC versus just dependents. So the first test is the relationship test, right? So this one is pretty clear. In order to claim somebody as a qualifying child for the child tax credit, the child has to be your son, daughter, it could be a stepchild, a foster child, an adopted child. It can also be your brother, right? So it can be your brother, sister, stepbrother, stepsister, half brother, or any descendants of those persons. So if you have, let's say your brother lives with you and your brother has a son, right? So this is your nephew. If you do meet the relationship test in that regard, right? So that's the first check mark to take off your list, and then obviously all the other elements have to be met as well. But it doesn't have to necessarily be your child, right? It could be a descendant of someone that is related to you, right? So it is relatively broad. The age test, now this is the big one. Okay, so the child, in order to be a qualifying child for the child tax credit, the child has to be under the age of 17 by the end of the year. So if they turn 17 on the last day of the year, they're not a qualifying child for purposes of the CTC. Now, this is where there's a big difference between what is a qualifying child for dependent purposes, right? So in order for someone to meet the definition of a qualifying child and a dependent to be claimed on your return, they have to be under 19 at the end of the year. Okay, so if you have a child that's 18 and you meet all the other tests, the age test, they've met that for purposes of being a dependent, but because they're 18 and they're not under age 17, then they are not going to meet the age test for purposes of the CTC. So that's one big sticking point that a lot of people overlook is they think, okay, well, I have a son that's under 19, or I have a child that's a student, right? So if they're a full-time student, they can be under the age of 24 and still qualify as a dependent, but they're not going to meet the definition of qualified child for purposes of the child tax credit. Now, the support test is pretty clear, right? The child can't provide over half of their own support for the 2022 year. Now, notice what this means is that the support does not necessarily have to come from you as the taxpayer. So the stipulation is that the child, him or herself, cannot be providing the support. So the support could come from another parent. It can come from another relative. That's fine. And you could still potentially claim them as a dependent and claim the child tax credit. It just, the support can't come from their own means, right? So the child can't be working, let's say, and providing more than half of their own support. Now, the residence test is also pretty straightforward. This is the same test for the qualifying child for CTC and just the dependent. The child has to have lived with you for more than half the year. Now, the exceptions here for separated or divorced parents, the parent that is the custodial parent, meaning the parent that actually has the child living with them for more than half the year, that is generally the parent that's going to be claiming the child. The other parent where they're not living with them for more than half of the year, the non-custodial parent, they generally can't unless they meet all the other tests and the custodial parent waives the right to claim that child. So the custodial parent can complete the IRS form 8332, provide that to the other parent and say, hey, look, even though I'm the custodial parent, the kid lives with me for more than half the year, I'm going to waive the right to claim them on my taxes this year, and so you can file the dependency claim and then ultimately maybe claim the child tax credit. So that residence test, it can be a bit tricky. Now, the dependency claim, so this is kind of an obvious one, right? So in order to claim the child tax credit, you have to claim the child as a dependent on your return. Now, remember, the qualifying child for the CTC is a more precise definition of what it means to be a qualifying child for a dependent, but every qualifying child for purposes of the CTC has to be a dependent on your return. And then lastly, the citizenship test. So the child has to have a social security number, right? So they've got to be a U.S. citizen, U.S. national, or other kind of resident. And there are special rules for adopted children that live with a taxpayer all year, right? So if it's adopted child, let's say from abroad, so they might not have citizenship or permanent residency yet. If they are adopted, there is a carve out there, and so they don't necessarily have to be a citizen or permanent resident of the United States, so long as they live with the taxpayer that's claiming them as a dependent throughout the entire tax year. All right, so that covers it for this video. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment below, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next one. Thanks.